Now, the University of Oxford's brilliant professor of theoretical epidemiology, Sunetra Gupta, has been a heroic contrarian throughout the pandemic. Professor Gupta has stood firm by her belief from day one that lockdowns cause more harm than good, bravely opposing doomsday sage modelling and our hysterical mainstream media. She also co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration with two other great scientific minds and friends of the show, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Dr. Martin Kulldorff, which was censored and deliberately smeared by lockdown fanatic Dr. Anthony Fauci, according to leaked emails over the weekend. Sunetra and her courageous colleagues have been ignored and vilified throughout the pandemic for challenging the ominous COVID orthodoxy and appealing for a less damaging approach to COVID rather than shutting down society at will. But now it's critical. The world hears Professor Gupta's views on Omicron and how we should really be reacting to it. So I'm delighted that Professor Gupta joins me tonight. Professor Gupta, thank you so much for joining me tonight. You have some fascinating analysis about Omicron that actually suggests that this variant isn't spreading much faster than the other variants.
Indeed. I mean, I think what's been ignored here is the fact that actually this coronavirus, like any other coronavirus, is doing what it says on the tin of coronavirus epidemiology. So I still maintain that there was actually a big peak prior to March 2020 in this country. And then what we are seeing subsequently in this country and everywhere else on the planet really is this dynamic playing out in the context of seasonal fluctuations in transmissibility and a natural loss of immunity against infection, both and also immunity against infection as conferred by vaccines. And that's sort of determining the epidemiology. But what's really brilliant is that both natural infection and vaccines are protecting us from severe disease and death. And when I say us, I actually don't mean me. I mean the people who are actually vulnerable to death and severe disease and death. And those are the people we should have been focusing on right from the start.
Yeah. Of course we should have.
Because the alternatives that were suggested to try and contain the spread of this virus were unrealistic and caused enormous collateral damage.
And you and I have been speaking about that collateral damage for more than 18 months. Are you frustrated that here we are, 21 months after the first lockdown, talking about another lockdown that will destroy the economy again, cause a multitude of other health issues, add to the mental health crisis, rather than embracing this idea of focused protection, which is what the Great Barrington Declaration is about, which would mean putting a shield essentially around the most vulnerable in society?
I am full of despair because, I mean, we've already caused so much harm, particularly to children, which I think it's just unbearable to think of the harm that we've already caused and are prepared to continue to cause. And that I just find it absolutely unbearable. But as I did, 20 months ago, thinking of what lockdowns would do to the vulnerable, young children for whom not going to school meant not getting a hot meal, not being monitored to see if something terrible was going on in their lives, as well as the multitude of people internationally for whom a lockdown spelled death, or at least starvation of some sort. And, it's the costs of lockdown are so profound that, and were so evidently profound right at the start. I don't understand why people were so, so willingly entered into that proposal that this would be the one way that we could get out of this situation. The epidemic is very real. and we needed to manage it, and it has caused many deaths, many of which were probably avoidable. But what was the way to avoid them? The way to avoid them was by shielding those vulnerable people from exposure while we built up herd immunity, which is actually the way in which we deal with respiratory illnesses and the various other illnesses that we live with. It is by building up immunity in the population to a level that actually reduces the risk to the vulnerable, to those who might actually die of the infection. So we have to stop being afraid of infection itself. That's just a condition of life. And at the same time, we have to really, really think very carefully about how to protect people who might die of the infection, but also how to protect people who might die if we fixate on preventing infection.
Totally. You also think, well, tell me if I'm wrong, but you also believe that the government's priority when it comes to the booster program is wrong. You think all people should be offered a first vaccination before we start boosting people in this country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that there is really any reason to offer the vaccine to anybody unless they are vulnerable. Now, you might say, well, who's vulnerable? Well, there's a very obvious category of people who are vulnerable, which relates mainly to their age and obvious comorbidities, which by now, I mean, we already have the evidence to make, you can use a risk calculator to see, am I vulnerable? Do I have these comorbidities, or am I of an advanced stage? Or, you can decide who is vulnerable on those terms. And then, of course, there are some people who might miss. So, I'm prepared for people to come up with a rational strategy. Let's say everyone over 50, which includes me, should be vaccinated. And that's why I participated very willingly in that first round of vaccines that were offered to those of us over 50. And because that is really a form of focused protection. And now the boosters should also be used in that regard, if necessary, to bolster protection amongst those who are vulnerable. And more importantly, across the world, we need to use these vaccines to protect those who haven't received any vaccines at all yet. And that's what we should be worrying about, rather than keeping case numbers down. That's just vanity. That's a sort of national vanity.
Now, the Great Barrington Declaration has over 850,000 signatures, including some of the world's top scientists. You're obviously one of 3 co-authors. We've learnt over the past 3 days, Professor Gupta, that there was quite an extraordinary attempt by Dr. Anthony Fauci in the US and his henchmen to essentially try and take down the Great Barrington Declaration immediately after it was published last year. And your co-author, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, someone who regularly appears on this show, has said, so I now know what it feels like to be the subject of a propaganda attack by my own government. Discussion and engagement would have been a better path. How did you feel to read these emails between Dr. Fauci trying to take down the Great Barrington Declaration?
Well, obviously it was very sad, but Carl Hennigan and I have experienced the same thing in this country. We were victims of some kind of peculiar propaganda campaign last year, at the beginning of this year, really, where there was this concerted effort to discredit us, discredit our proposal that we should introduce focused protection or take the limited amount of resources we had to try and protect the vulnerable people in care homes and to ensure that children and also university students, the people I teach, to not be derelict in our duties to these people, to young people, which is what life is really all about. it is about celebrating young people. That are calls to do that and to suggest that we have a reasonable and sensible debate surrounding how we can do that, and also, try and mitigate the effects of COVID. These efforts were completely misrepresented and maligned, and we were the victims of a campaign, clearly. It's very obvious when you look at the ways in which we were discredited. There was a sort of line which, again, sort of centered around accusations of us having apparently said that the epidemic was over. Now, if we thought the epidemic was over, why were we spending so much time and energy and putting ourselves, our necks on the line, to write something like the Great Barrington Declaration? What was the purpose of that if we thought the epidemic was over in March 2020? I mean, it's insane. But there we go. People wanted to discredit us. And sadly, many scientists, many colleagues, many friends were happy to sign up to that campaign. It is something that has been extremely damaging to me psychologically, but also, sadly, I think and much more importantly, not having that debate, I think, is what's left us now in this position, which is just terrifying, actually.
Well, it is. It's terrifying. It's devastating. We're talking about perpetual lockdowns. So all I can say, Professor Sunetra Gupta, is that you have been an absolute hero of mine throughout this entire pandemic.